Hello there. Today, we're diving into the darkest corners of human history, where killers didn't just take lives, they spread fear beyond imagination. Here are the 6 most brutal serial killers in history of life monsters who once walked among us. 1. Andrei Chikatilo, the Butcher of Rostov. When I first read the case file of Andrei Chikatilo, my hands trembled not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of what one man could do. Born in 1936 in the war-torn Soviet Union, Chikatilo grew up in a landscape ravaged by famine, violence, and silence. That silence would follow him and serve him well in the dark. He was not an obvious monster. A former school teacher with soft speech and a weak frame, Chikatilo was dismissed by most who met him as unremarkable. But beneath the quiet facade was a man tormented by impotence, humiliation, and a compulsive need to dominate. His crimes were not random. They were ritualistic acts of vengeance against a world that rendered him powerless. Between 1978 and 1990, Chikatilo murdered at least 52 victims, mostly women and children. The pattern was chilling. He would lure his victims near train stations or secluded paths, offering them candy, money, or promises of work. Once isolated, he would strike with sudden, frenzied violence, stabbing, mutilating, and often gouging out eyes, believing they could capture his soul. But the true horror wasn't just the brutality, it was the cold precision. Chikatilo operated under the noses of Soviet authorities for over a decade, exploiting a flawed justice system obsessed with appearances. In one tragic twist, another man was even executed for one of Chikatilo's murders, a grim testament to the state's desperation to maintain control. What set Chikatilo apart from other killers was his psychological profile. He wasn't driven purely by sadism, nor just by sexual desire. Forensic psychiatrists later diagnosed him with a borderline personality disorder, sadistic tendencies, and schizoid features. His impotency became the root of his rage hiss, inability to perform sexually translated into a savage need to kill. With every victim, he wasn't just taking a life, he was reclaiming a twisted sense of manhood. But even monsters stumble. Chikatilo's downfall came not from a mistake in his method, but from relentless surveillance and psychological profiling by Soviet investigator Viktor Burakov. For years, Burakov chased shadows, frustrated by political interference and archaic police techniques. But through profiling and sheer obsession, he closed in. In 1990, Chikatilo was finally caught after being spotted loitering suspiciously near a train station. The interrogation was a battle of wills. Chikatilo resisted for days, but once he began confessing, the details flowed with disturbing calm. He drew maps, named victims, even described the sounds they made as they died. At trial, he sat in a steel cage, man the court deemed too dangerous to even breathe the same air as others. In 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the head. His final words were never recorded. But his legacy endures in blood and silence, proof that evil can wear the plainest face and that the worst monsters walk in daylight. 2. Albert Fish, the boogeyman of 20th century America. Some killers leave behind patterns, others nightmares. Albert Fish left behind both. When investigators first opened his letters, they thought they were reading fiction macabre, unimaginable horror tales. But the truth was far worse. This wasn't the script of a madman, it was a confession. Albert Fish was born in 1870 in Washington, D.C., into a family riddled with mental illness. From a young age, he exhibited disturbing behaviors, self-harm, masochism, and an obsession with religious punishment. He would insert needles into his groin and beat himself with a nail-studded paddle. But the darkness inside Fish only deepened with time. Fish's crimes began with an urge not just to harm, but to consume. Between the 1920s and 1930s, he claimed to have molested over 100 children, but it was the murder and cannibalization of 10-year-old Grace Budd in 1928 that shocked the nation and cemented his infamy. He lured Grace under the pretense of taking her to a birthday party. Instead, he brought her to an abandoned house, strangled her, and over the course of days, ate parts of her body. Years later, he sent a detailed letter to her mother, describing what he did with chilling indifference. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. This wasn't merely perversion. It was a spiritual delusion fused with sadism. Fish believed he was fulfilling divine punishment. He referenced passages from the Bible to justify his acts and claimed God instructed him to sacrifice children as penance. The boundaries between his religious hallucinations and real-world horror collapsed entirely. Inside his mind was a warped universe where pain equaled purity and innocence needed to be defiled to set it free. Psychiatrists later described him as a psychiatric phenomenon, a sadomasochist, a schizophrenic and possibly psychotic, yet alarmingly coherent. He functioned in daily life, holding jobs, raising children, even writing poetry. The investigation into Grace Budd's disappearance stretched for 6 years, but it was that haunting letter mail to her family that finally cracked the case. The stationery bore a tiny clue, an emblem from a New York lodging house. Investigators traced it back, leading to Albert Fish's arrest in 1934. In court, the jury was forced to listen to the details of his crimes in full. Many cried. Some became physically ill. Even hardened detectives admitted they'd never heard anything so depraved. Still, Fish's defense pleaded insanity, and in truth it wasn't far from it, but the jury chose death. Albert Fish was executed by electric chair in 1936 at Sing Sing prison. As he was strapped in, he reportedly whispered, "It will be the supreme thrill." The man who once called himself the Gray Man and the Werewolf of Wisteria died with the same calm that marked his crimes. But for many Americans, Albert Fish wasn't just a criminal. He was evil incarnate, the boogeyman made real. His case changed how America viewed mental illness, child protection, and what one human could do to another. 3. Pedro Lopez, the Shadow of the Andes. In all my years investigating the darkest corners of human behavior, few names send a chill down my spine quite like Pedro Lopez. He wasn't a killer in the traditional sense. He was a wanderer, moving silently across borders, a ghost leaving tragedy in his wake. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born in 1948 in a harsh and unforgiving part of Colombia. His early life was defined by poverty, abandonment, and violence. As a child, he lived on the streets, experiencing trauma that shaped him in deeply disturbing ways. What began as survival gradually turned into something far more sinister. Lopez's crimes stretched across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, where he targeted vulnerable communities in remote and impoverished areas. For years, disappearances of young girls went largely unnoticed, dismissed as runaways or lost to the dangers of rural life. Lopez exploited this silence. His movements were erratic, but his pattern was not. He gained trust quickly, knew where to look, and vanished before questions were even asked. What makes Lopez's case so unsettling is not only the scale of the crimes he confessed to for 300 disappearances, but the way he recounted them. His memory was methodical. He spoke not with rage, but with disturbing calm and clarity. He led authorities to grave sites, described timelines, even noted weather conditions. In 1980, authorities in Ecuador arrested Lopez after a series of tragic discoveries in the Ambato region. Initially skeptical of his claims, investigators soon realized that the locations he identified aligned with real, unsolved missing persons cases. The puzzle pieces fit, the map he drew led them to truth. Psychological evaluations revealed a man detached from empathy but driven by deep-seated compulsions. Experts described him as suffering from severe antisocial traits, showing no remorse and expressing disturbing justifications for his behavior. He didn't act from passion or revenge, he acted from an internal urge, a ritualistic need to dominate and erase. Lopez was ultimately convicted and sentenced under Ecuadorian law at the time, which imposed a maximum penalty far below what his crimes warranted. After serving less than 2 decades, he was released in the late 1990s. He was briefly held again in Colombia for psychiatric evaluation, but then, astonishingly, he disappeared. To this day, Pedro Lopez remains a fugitive. His name occasionally resurfaces in rumors and unconfirmed reports, but there's no official record of his current location. His vanishing serves as a grim reminder that even in the age of modern justice systems, some predators slip through the cracks. What haunts investigators most is not only what he did, but what he might still be capable of. In cases like Lopez's, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the system fails, and when it does, the consequences echo far beyond courtrooms and headlines. 4. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Some killers are erratic. Some leave trails of chaos. But Gary Ridgway was different organized, methodical, emotionless. He didn't kill out of rage. He killed out of routine. Ridgway earned his nickname the Green River Killer after. Several victims were found near the Green River in Washington state during the early 1980s. But the true scope of his crimes would take decades to unravel. In the end, it was revealed that Ridgway was the most prolific convicted serial killer in American history, officially connected to 49 victims, though he confessed to 71, and investigators believe the real number could be over 90. Born in 1949 in Salt Lake City, Ridgway's early life offered subtle clues of what was to come. He was a quiet, withdrawn child, with a strict and sometimes volatile home life. He struggled in school, especially with reading, and was known for his low self-esteem. But it was his relationship with his mother domineering, shaming, and highly controlling that many psychologists point to as the root of his conflicted attitudes toward women. Ridgway later admitted to having violent fantasies as early as adolescence. He joined the Navy in his 20s and served in Vietnam. But when he returned to civilian life, the fantasies grew stronger and soon turned into action. His victims were often vulnerable women, some involved in high-risk lifestyles, which he later claimed made them easy to kill. He'd often lure them in his pickup truck, gain their trust, and then, in isolated areas, commit the crimes with chilling calm. Many of the victims were found in wooded areas, near rivers or ravines dumped, covered with brush, or left in clusters. What made Ridgway so difficult to catch was his unassuming life. He worked for over 30 years as a truck painter. He was married multiple times. He attended church regularly. To those who knew him casually, he seemed mild, even forgettable. That camouflage allowed him to operate for 2 decades without detection. But behind that mask was a man who planned his killings like errands. He kept souvenirs, he revisited crime scenes, and he continued working his day job as if nothing happened. For Ridgway, murder wasn't just impulse, it was habit. In the early 2000s, advances in DNA forensics finally caught up to him. Cold case evidence from the 1980s was re-examined, and new technology linked Ridgway to several victims. He was arrested in 2001, and under interrogation, he began to confess not out of guilt, but with the detachment of someone discussing a grocery list. "I killed so many women, I have a hard time keeping them straight," he told investigators. Ridgway ultimately accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. In exchange for cooperation and full disclosure, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. His statements helped investigators locate dozens of additional remains. Today, Gary Ridgway resides in Washington State Penitentiary, serving multiple life sentences. He shows little remorse and even less understanding of the lives he destroyed. What chills me most is not the number of victims, but the fact that for so many years, he blended into everyday life. It raises a haunting question for all of us. How well do we really know the people around us? 5. Ted Bundy, the charming face of evil. Ted Bundy wasn't the kind of man people feared. He was articulate, clean-cut, confident, exactly the kind of person we're taught to trust. And that's what made him deadly. Born in 1946 in Vermont, Bundy's early life was cloaked in deception. He was raised believing his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his sister. That lead, combined with feelings of abandonment and confusion about his identity, would come to shape his fractured personality. By his teenage years, he was already showing signs of detachment, manipulation, and emotional coldness. But unlike many serial offenders, Bundy didn't strike from the shadows. He walked among discerning degrees, dating, volunteering at suicide hotlines, even getting involved in politics. He crafted an image, and it worked. That mask of charm was his most dangerous weapon. Between 1974 and 1978, Bundy murdered dozens of young women across 7 U.S. states. The true number is still unknown, but he confessed to 30 killings. His method was calculated. He would fake an injury using a sling or crutches and ask women for help near libraries, campuses, or parking lots. Once in his car, the facade vanished. He overpowered them with brutal force and took them to remote areas. Bundy didn't just kill. He staged, relived, and ritualized his crimes, often revisiting crime scenes long after the act. He displayed a chilling combination of narcissism and psychopathy. To him, his victims weren't people. They were objects' reflections of his need to control, dominate, and annihilate. Yet, despite the mounting cases, Bundy stayed steps ahead of law enforcement. He changed vehicles, cities, tactics. He escaped custody twice, once by jumping from a second-story courthouse window in Colorado, and again by slipping through a ceiling panel in jail. After his second escape, he traveled to Florida, where he committed one of his most savage attacks at the Chi Omega sorority house in 1978, killing 2 women and bludgeoning 2 others within minutes. Bundy was finally captured later that year while driving a stolen vehicle. When questioned, he denied everything at first, but gradually, as trial approached, cracks began to show. He represented himself in court, cross-examined witnesses, and manipulated the media with ease. His case became a national spectacle, a handsome, intelligent man accused of horrifying crimes. Some refused to believe it, others were drawn to it. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bite marks, witness testimony, and physical traces tied him to the murders. He was convicted and sentenced to death. On the 24th of January, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair. As he faced his final moments, he offered no real apology, only vague admissions of guilt. What makes Bundy so terrifying isn't just what he did, it's how normal he seemed. He shattered the stereotype of what a monster looks like. He reminded us that evil doesn't always come with snarls or shadows. Sometimes it smiles, shakes your hand, and tells you exactly what you want to hear. And for many, that realization was more terrifying than the crimes themselves. 6. Luis Garavito, the Beast of Colombia. When I first reviewed the Garavito case files, I had to stop halfway through. Not because the details were unclear, but because they were too clear. There is evil that shocks, and then there is evil that rewrites the boundaries of human cruelty. Luis Alfredo Garavito, born in 1957 in Colombia, is believed to be one of the most prolific serial killers ever recorded, with estimates placing his victim count at over 300 children. Even today, the full number may never be known. He operated in poor, rural areas across Colombia during the 1990s, a time when civil conflict, guerrilla warfare, and poverty left many children vulnerable and invisible. Garavito's early life was steeped in instability. He was raised in an abusive household, subjected to both physical and psychological trauma. Teachers described him as troubled, withdrawn, and volatile. By adolescence, he had begun showing signs of severe emotional disturbance, including violent outbursts and inappropriate behavior. But like many future offenders, no one intervened. His methods were manipulative and horrifyingly effective. He would disguise him sometimes as a priest, a teacher, or a disabled man to gain the trust of young boys. Once isolated, the crimes were committed in secluded fields or abandoned buildings, always following a disturbingly repetitive pattern. For Garavito, these weren't impulsive acts. They were ritualized, calculated, and premeditated. Investigators were initially overwhelmed. Dozens of bodies began to appear across multiple regions, all with similar characteristics. But no one realized they were dealing with a single predator until 1997, when a mass grave uncovered in southern Colombia revealed patterns too distinct to ignore. Garvido's capture was as strange as it was inevitable. Police found a discarded bag filled with notes, identification documents, and glasses items linked to the crimes. Through detailed forensic work and fingerprint matching, they tracked him down in 1999. When arrested, he confessed in chilling detail to hundreds of murders. The psychological profile compiled afterward was alarming. Garvido displayed traits of psychopathy, extreme narcissism, and compulsive behavior. He was also deeply manipulative, capable of appearing remorseful when it suited him. In private, however, he revealed no real guilt. He described his crimes with eerie detachment, often referencing his own trauma as a justification. Despite the scale of his crimes, Garvido was sentenced to 1,853 years in prison. But due to Colombian legal limits, he could serve no more than 40 years, and possibly even less with good behavior. That caused national outrage. In a country already scarred by conflict and injustice, the idea that a man responsible for so much suffering could one day walk free was unthinkable. In response, Colombia revised certain aspects of its criminal code, particularly regarding serial crimes and child exploitation. But the fact remains, Garvido may not spend the rest of his life behind bars. He is currently imprisoned under high security, though his health has reportedly declined in recent years. Authorities keep his location secret for fear of retaliation. Even within the prison system, his crimes are seen as unforgivable. Luis Garavito was not just a killer. He was a systemic predator, someone who weaponized trust, poverty, and vulnerability on an almost industrial scale. His case stands as a final, chilling reminder in this series. Monsters are not born in fairy tales. They are built in the real world, brick by brick, through neglect, trauma, and the cracks in our systems that let them thrive. From Chikatilo to Garavito, these 6 men remind us that evil is not one shape or sound. It hides in charisma, silence, and routine. It wears uniforms, glasses, and polite smiles. What binds them together is not just what they did, but how long they got away with it. Understanding these killers isn't about glorifying their actions. It's about learning how they operated, why they did what they did, and how we can stop it from ever happening again. Because the greatest horror is not the monster we see, it's the one we never suspected.